So Jonathan is here for to talk about how YARP is useful for migrating the legacy ASP.NET application into the ASP.NET Core. Right. Hello, Jonathan, how are you?
All right, thanks, Justin. I appreciate the introduction. Maybe some who are watching saw earlier at about 15:30 Pacific time, there was another session that was hosted by some Microsoft employees that was called Upgrading from .NET Framework to .NET 7, and they referenced this talk that we're about to do together here. We're going to go into some more detail. They talked about upgrading all kinds of different projects from .NET Framework to .NET 7. We're going to focus specifically on ASP.NET projects moving from Framework to Core.
Sure. I'm really excited. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and it's all on you.
All right. Thanks, Justin. I appreciate that. Let's go ahead and get started. As Justin mentioned, my name is Jonathan Tower. I go by Jay for short. And I'm going to be talking about migrating your legacy ASP.NET project to ASP.NET Core and doing it incrementally with something called YARP, which you may have heard about or you may have not heard about. But by the end of this talk, I hope you're somewhat familiar with it and you know how to get started. So this is kind of the problem. A lot of us have these ASP.NET applications that have been around for a long time. They're running on .NET Framework. Many of them are very large code bases, and it would take us a long time if we kind of locked ourselves in a room and tried to upgrade the whole thing, over a weekend or something. That wouldn't really be possible. But we want to start moving them in the direction of ASP.NET Core, because ASP.NET Core and ASP.NET 7 most recently has all these great improvements, all these great things, features and performance improvements. The performance is huge. In that earlier upgrading from .NET Framework talk that I referenced, they talked about some of those numbers, and it's really phenomenal when you look at how much better ASP.NET 7 or 6 or one of these recent versions performs than when you're talking about ASP.NET running on .NET Framework. So you've got this big application. There's a lot of investment into it. And maybe you already know this, but a lot of projects are pretty easy to upgrade to .NET 7. And ASP.NET projects are pretty different from ASP.NET projects on .NET Framework. And so it's a bit more of a heavy lift. And some of that is because all of the great improvements in ASP.NET Core that are kind of breaking changes with ASP.NET before that. So with all of these things in mind, we're thinking, how do we go ahead and upgrade our applications in an incremental way that allows us to take advantage of all these great features of ASP.NET Core? There's a bunch of different approaches. There's probably millions of approaches. These are a few of the most popular ways that people try and accomplish this. There's this big bang approach. This is where, you lock the team into a conference room over maybe a few days. People slide pizza in under the door, and nobody is allowed out until the whole application has been upgraded. This is really not a great way to do it. Maybe for a small application, this makes sense, but for most big applications that you've been holding off on upgrading because of the investment involved, this is not a really good approach. There's this evolutionary approach we're going to talk about. There's the Strangler Fig approach that I'm going to really suggest as a great way of doing it, and then show you a tool called YARP that helps us do that approach. So I talked about this big bang approach. This is that one where the team is all locked into the conference room together. Just like this team here is all kind of frustrated with each other. This can be a really, a way that leads to a lot of frustration if you're trying to upgrade your app, especially if it's a big app in this way. So I don't recommend the big bang approach for most projects. The evolutionary approach can be one that makes a lot of sense. This is an approach where you can kind of think of it as a waves approach. So you're going to make some adjustments to your application to refactor it to be more into .NET Core or .NET 6 or 7. And then, there's going to be some things that don't work the way you want. And so you're going to have to refactor those to fix them. And then, you're going to repeat that process, and it's going to be waves. And you're going to have to think a lot about how you organize that and what features you choose to do first, and what features, when they're done, allow you to do a production release. If you're really going to take any advantage of this approach by releasing to production, it's going to be really tricky. So how do you do that in an incremental way while you're still kind of pushing out these changes incrementally as you make them and taking advantage of, these performance improvements and things that we're getting out of .NET, and ASP.NET Core. So the way we do this is this approach called the Strangler Fig approach. It's based on this plant called a Strangler Fig plant. I believe it's based in Australia. And this plant actually germinates in the tops of the trees, like in crevices, in the branches of a tree. And it'll actually start growing a vine down to the ground until it gets to the ground. Then I'll shoot out some leaves up at the top in the canopy and shoot some roots down around the tree's roots. Eventually, those roots are going to wrap around the tree's roots and kind of choke out that tree. So that's that strangler part of the Strangler Fig. And eventually that tree is actually going to die. And what you basically have left is this like dead, empty, hollow tree that is like a backbone now for this fig plant or vine that has grown on it. And the tree kind of serves, even though it's no longer alive, it serves a second life now, holding this vine plant up high so that it can get sunlight from above the canopy. And we can use a very similar approach when we're trying to upgrade a large application to a new framework. So this is kind of what that might look like just in general terms. Early in your migration process, you'd probably set up a facade layer. What that would basically do is that would basically bring the old and the new applications together and kind of put them under one roof, make them all look like they're exactly the same to the front end part of the application, so that the front end application is none the wiser about all of these changes that are going on behind the scenes, and kind of keeps that interface with your front end applications stable. But you'd start out with obviously a larger legacy application with more of your code in there. You'd start moving it over to this modern application that would start out being smaller. Over time, you would actually see that modern applications start to get bigger, eventually bigger than the legacy application, because you've moved over half of your code over there. And then eventually you actually get to the point where you've finally moved all of your code over and the migration is now complete. You can probably now get rid of that facade layer because you've now moved everything over into the modern framework. So this is kind of that Strangler Fig pattern that we want to approach to migrate our ASP.NET applications to ASP.NET Core. The tool that we're going to use to do that is something called YARP. It's kind of a funny name. It stands for Yet Another Reverse Proxy. There are a handful of reverse proxy products out there in the market these days, and YARP is the one that was built on top of ASP.NET and .NET. And so this is the one that really makes a lot of sense for .NET developers to use. It was actually built inside at Microsoft, and it was built based on some demand from some internal teams that were asking for a product exactly like this to do some reverse proxying. And it's basically a customizable proxy that you can customize with configuration, with C# code. It's built on top of .NET Core infrastructure. That means that it supports ASP.NET Core applications from 3.1 and later, all the way up to 7, where we're at today. And because it's .NET Core, it also means that it runs on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS equally as well, and containers, of course, as well. Super easy to get it into your project. It's actually just a NuGet package that you bring into your project, and then you're able to start setting it up. You can also use it in both Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code projects, and the team plans in the future to add lots of other great new functionality, including like a pre-built executable so that you can run the YARP executable at a command line, and then also a bunch of project templates that are coming in the future, as well as a bunch of other really great improvements. So you might be asking already, Jay, you keep saying reverse proxy. What does that mean? What is a reverse proxy? Is it a proxy that only goes, backwards? No, not exactly, but that's a little bit on the right track. So perhaps you're familiar already with what a regular proxy is, or it's called a forward proxy. So that would be where clients are trying to access the internet or servers out on the internet, and they would all connect through a single server, which would be called a proxy server. to access the internet and then all the servers out there on the internet. So that would be like outgoing traffic to the internet from inside on a network. That's a typical setup for a forward proxy. What's a reverse proxy? Well, it's basically that, except you just swap it around in the middle here. So now instead of outgoing traffic, you've got clients connecting through the internet. And then when they terminate their requests, they terminate at a proxy server, which then proxies that request into one or more servers internally. So now you've got internal servers receiving incoming traffic from the internet through a proxy. So that's really all a reverse proxy is. Now you might be wondering, how would we use that to incrementally upgrade ASP.NET applications to ASP.NET Core? So let's show you a little bit about how that process would work. So let's say you've got clients out here on the internet and they're going to go ahead and request some information from an ASP.NET Core application. So that request is going to come in. We're going to have our middleware pipeline set up here in our ASP.NET Core application. And near the top of that pipeline, or at least as I've diagrammed it here, near the top of that pipeline is going to be YARP. And YARP is going to receive that request, and it's going to basically look at its configuration file and say, does this route match the configurations that are available in this in this application that I'm forwarding to? And if it is, it'll go ahead and forward it back to an application that's running behind it, which in this case would be an ASP.NET application. So now it basically forwarded that request that the user made all the way through, and the ASP.NET application receives it, basically none the wiser that it's actually received that from a proxy instead of from the client directly. And now when the ASP.NET application responds, that'll go back out through the ASP.NET Core application, and it'll be proxied back out to the clients. And in that ASP.NET project, we probably have some controller classes that'll actually handle that request. So now let's look at what happens if it does not match one of the routes that can be forwarded. So if we come in here and a request comes in, it hits YARP first. YARP will check its configuration, and it'll realize that this is not a URL that is going to actually forward into to one of the backing applications. So it's going to go ahead and make this request. It's going to go ahead and let this request bubble down through the middleware stack, which means it's going to go off to MVC next, which we have running in this application. This could be, model view controller with views, Razor views. It could be Razor pages. It could be RESTful APIs. Whatever is next in the stack here in the middleware is going to receive that next. Let's say it's MVC, and one of these controllers that's in our ASP.NET Core application actually is going to handle that request. So it goes ahead and responds directly. So going back to our original Strangler Fig diagram here, where we've got the facade layer and our legacy and modern applications that are kind of receiving those requests from the facade layer, you could kind of think of it as what we've got here on the right. So ASP.NET Core is running with both YARP and a new application, which in this case will be MVC. That MVC application would have all of the newly migrated code that's been moved to ASP.NET Core. And then when appropriate, YARP will also forward things back to the legacy ASP.NET application as well. So I think you can see how the ASP.NET Core application plays a couple of roles here. YARP running inside of ASP.NET Core, it's going to play the role of that facade layer, and MVC or whatever other framework we're using there is going to play the role of the modern application in this model, and ASP.NET, of course, is playing the role of the legacy application. So this is generally the approach that we would go about using to do this. So let's go ahead and look at this in action now. I'm going to pull up a code example here, and what I've got here is an ASP.NET application that was, if I open up the property pages here, you can see this is a .NET Framework 4.8 application. And I'm going to try and upgrade this using YARP. And that'll allow me to basically incrementally move my code over. Now, this is a very simple starter project that I created here with just a few controllers, and you can see there's just a few views that map to those controllers. So it's very simple logic. Obviously, your applications are going to be much more complicated than that, but this will be simple enough that we can kind of see how the pieces all fit together. Now, before we get right into that, I want to show you a few things that I've set up ahead of time. One of them is an extension. So if I come up here to the extensions menu and say manage extensions, I want to look at the already installed extensions. And you'll notice that there's one here that is called Microsoft Project Migrations. And you'll also notice that in parentheses afterwards, it says here that that is an experimental plugin here or extension for Visual Studio. The description says it provides experimental experience for migrating ASP.NET applications to ASP.NET Core. So this is some tooling that the .NET team has been kind of experimenting with, which is why it's still in kind of a provisional or experimental status at the moment. But this is some tooling that I think is moving along very quickly and is something that's going to make it even easier to automate some of the simple parts of this process or some of the what you might call boring parts of this process, so that you don't have to do all of the work yourself. Obviously, it's still a complicated process, and there's no two projects that are exactly the same. So some of your code is still going to have to be manually fixed, even after this plugin helps you migrate some of it. So even when it's in a production release version 1, it's probably not going to do 100% of everything for you, but I think you'll see as we're playing around with it tonight that this is actually going to allow you to do some pretty cool stuff automatically. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you. The second thing I wanted to show you is that I've got a test page, and I'm just going to go ahead and open the Razor for that test page. You can see it's a pretty simple page here. It's got this is a couple of divs nested inside of each other and an H2 tag that tells me this is my ASP.NET project, and then this unordered list called my list. And then finally, we've got a script section here that's going to basically do some jQuery to go make a call to API/values on this current server. And it's going to make a request to get some application JSON data. From that, when it comes back, it's going to go through each of these items and append them to the MyList UL tag. And it's going to add these as list items to that tag with each of the values in it, so we can basically see what came back from the service. So that's the first thing I want to show you. The second thing I wanted to show you in the code here is that we have a values controller. This is an API controller. So this is using, in .NET Framework here, we call this Web API. So this is a Web API controller. And you can see that there's a get method that's just going to return value 1 and value 2 as a hard-coded set of array results. And that's the values that are actually going to get put into that unordered list on my test page. So let's go ahead and run this a second here so we can just see it working before any migration stuff has happened. Okay, so we can see here we've got the ASP.NET template for a .NET Framework for this version of ASP.NET. I'm going to go to my test page, and you can see actually it's loading in value 1 and value 2. And if you're the type of person that maybe needs to see it happen to actually believe it, I'll go ahead and refresh this page. And you can see in the console here that a values request has happened. That's gone to my local host, current port /API/values. And that has actually returned an array with value 1 and value 2 strings. Okay, so then that got added by the jQuery code into this list right here. So that's basically how this legacy application works. Now I want to go ahead and upgrade that. And I'm going to go ahead and use that migration extension that I showed you that I installed. And so once I have that installed, I can actually just right click on projects or files and get some new options in here. So I'll start by clicking on the project, and you'll notice right under the publish option here that I've got a new option called Migrate Project that you maybe have never seen before. So I'm going to pick that option, and we get some interesting new UI here that opens up in this tab that says ASP.NET Migrations, and it basically describes what's going to happen. It can help you migrate to .NET 6 and beyond. And I can click this button to migrate to the latest new project. There's a couple of options for how you want to get this started. I've heard the feedback from the team at Microsoft right now that this actually works best in this experimental version if you use a new project. So we're going to do that. You can technically, and hopefully it'll work better in the future, pick an existing project and basically say, I already started an ASP.NET Core project, and I want to use this existing core project to start moving to be the target of my migrations from my ASP.NET project. So I'm going to go ahead and pick new project since we know that that'll work better. It's going to go ahead and give me a default name here. I could call this whatever I want, but since I called my other framework project is called just ASP.NET, it's calling this ASP.NET, and then it's a attached core to the end of that. And you can see here that I can actually target different frameworks that are installed on my machine. And as you've probably heard, if you've been watching the videos today, .NET 7 is the latest version that's just come out this week. This is a short-term support or standard term support version of .NET, and .NET 6, which came out last year, is the long-term support, which is supported for 3 years. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the .NET 6 because I want to do a long-term support version, but you could pick either one. And I'm going to hit the next button. And then I get this nice summary that's going to basically describe all of the things that it's going to do for me automatically on this project. So what does that include? Well, it includes creating a migration target project called ASP.NET Core, and then persisting information about the source project's properties into that. It's going to set both projects as startup projects. That's important because of the proxying that we looked at with the ASP.NET Core running the YARP for us. We actually need that running even if the requests get forwarded on to the ASP.NET project. And so we basically need both of them running. So it's going to go ahead and make that change for us. Under initialize project ASP.NET, it says it's going to set the start action to don't open a page. And that basically means that it's going to set that project up so that the legacy application, the ASP.NET one, is not going to open up a web browser. Just our ASP.NET Core one will, which is going to be our entry point to everything, since that's going to be our proxy as well. So that makes sense. And it's going to do a few things in the ASP.NET Core project to initialize it. It's going to add the YARP NuGet package and register that as a proxy in the project. It's going to also add something called the system.web adapters NuGet package. We're going to talk about that more in just a little bit. And then it's going to add the YARP settings to the application settings.json file. So I'm going to go ahead and click finish, and you'll see that it actually is going to do this quite fast. And you'll see it's doing like a NuGet restore. It's doing a build in the background. It's doing a bunch of other things to read my project and then do all of the steps that it said it was going to do to both of those two projects. And you can see now here it has completed successfully. So I'm going to go ahead and close that migration window. And now you notice in my Solution Explorer that I have both my legacy ASP.NET project and a new one called ASP.NET Core. So let's go ahead and look at what's in that project. First of all, I want to just show you here, if I look at the target framework for this project, you can see it's .NET 6, just like I asked it to be. And I could actually change that to other frameworks that are installed, but that is the one that I've selected. And then you notice that the application JSON file has a section in it called Reverse Proxy, and these are all the default settings that the migration tool has created for my YARP setup. So those are going to be read by my YARP setup. And if we also look at the references for this project, we'll see that it has a couple of packages in here. Just as we were talking about, there's going to be this web adapters. And you can see that's currently in our release candidate version. And then it's got a YARP reverse proxy NuGet package. And you can see that's in a release version. So that's the main tool that we're talking about here tonight. And then finally, I want to show you in the program CS. This is one that is a top level configuration or startup file. So you notice there's no main function, or there's no program or main function. But you notice a few things happening in here. The first one is that the services are adding the reverse proxy services, and it's loading its configuration from, if I scroll over here, you can see the section called reverse proxy in our application settings.json. So that's this whole section here. So that's where it's getting all of its settings from. And then you can see that if we scroll down just a little bit, that it's adding the system.web adapters. That's that other NuGet package. You might be wondering now, what does that system.web adapters do? Well, one of the problems with migrating an ASP.NET project to ASP.NET Core is the system.web namespace, or the system.web DLLs that exist in .NET Framework that have basically don't exist in .NET Core. And the reason they don't exist in .NET Core is because the way that those were written originally really tied together how ASP.NET accessed HTTP through IIS, the web server for Windows. And obviously, since .NET Now and .NET Core have been technologies that are built for multiple platforms, not just Windows, not just IIS, that needed to be decoupled. And so all of that's been decoupled. But that means that any code that you use that accesses things like cookies or headers in the request or the response, or does session information from the session storage of your application, all of that code is not going to migrate to ASP.NET Core. And so these system.web adapters actually provide some API consistency with those system.web namespaces, and then it maps those old APIs to the newer implementations of those in .NET Core and gives you some feature compatibility back to how you would have written that code in .NET Framework. So that allows you to bring some .NET Framework code that uses system.web namespaces forward with you before you kind of rewrite those the more modern way. And then the last thing I want you to notice here is that the reverse proxy is being mapped here. So that's kind of our new ASP.NET Core project and how that's set up. So now I want to show you one more thing before we actually try this out. And that is, I just want you to notice that there's only one path that's been mapped in the settings, and that is basically a catch-all. So essentially anything that can be matched to the application running in ASP.NET is going to be mapped to that backer application. And if it can't be, then it's going to try to map it here into the ASP.NET Core application. Okay, so before we actually run this, let's actually migrate that values controller over. So now that I have migrated, I can actually see that there's options here like migrate controller. If I right click on one of my controllers, if I also go back up here to the project level and pick migrate project again, you can see I get this kind of nice summary view that shows me the status of my migration process. And it also gives me some starting points to migrate some more code. So I can migrate controllers, I can migrate classes. And since this is a API controller, I'm going to actually find my values controller in here right now. So I'll go ahead and pick that. And you'll notice that it's actually basically gone through and figured out what all of the references are from that values controller and what things are going to need to be brought over with it. if there's other class files within the ASP.NET project that needed to be brought over as well, it would detect that and make copies of those, and any of their dependencies would move over as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click Migrate. All right, and now as soon as that finishes, I'm going to go down here to my ASP.NET Core project, and I can see now there's a controllers folder and a values controller inside of that. And in fact, I can see it's moved this file over here. Now, there's a couple of things missing from this early version of the code that it didn't do for me automatically. So I want to set a route on here. And I want to say that this routes to API/values. And then I'm also going to I'm going to go ahead and tell .NET Core that this is an API controller, so that it uses the conventions for API controllers for this controller. So there's a couple of little manual fix-ups in this early version that's not a release version yet of this tool that I have to do myself. But now, if I run this, I should basically get values that come from this values controller instead of from my old values controller in the ASP.NET project. So to prove that here, we're going to use the .NET Core version of the values controller. And I'm just going to say Core 1 and Core 2 for these values instead, so that I can tell where those are coming from. And I'll go ahead and click the Start button. Okay, so my debugger has started now, and I should have, there's my Chrome window. So I'll wait while both of the applications spin up. And you can see here, I'm now on a different port than I was on before. So I'm actually making this request to my .NET Core application. If I actually look at my .NET Core application under properties here in the launch settings, I can see that it is set up to use this port right here, 7227. So I'm actually hitting my .NET Core application, but you'll notice I'm actually getting the home view from my framework application. So it's forwarding that through as a proxy. And if I go to the test page, that works as well to actually load from the .NET Framework application. And then you've probably noticed already, I got Core 1 and Core 2 here in my response. And that is because I actually had migrated that controller over to my new application. And so if I refresh this, you'll see the values request is going to still API/values. But now the response is coming back with Core 1 and Core 2 instead of the original items that I had in my .NET Framework application. So I have now basically migrated one of my API controllers over to this new code. And that is basically how you do YARP. Quick recap here. So YARP is currently in version 1.1.1. So that's live on NuGet, and you can use that for production uses. The system web adapters is still in release candidate, and that migration extension that I showed you is still in an experimental status. But none of those things should stop you from using YARP today. YARP is totally ready as long as you're okay to do a little bit of migration work manually at this point and not rely on these tools as much as you will when they're in production. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's really interesting project. Wow. So I have a bunch of customers actually wanting to migrate their existing ASP.NET application into ASP.NET Core, but they are very hesitating. But yeah, this YARP library will be so helpful for them. So I will introduce them. Wow, that's really good.
Yeah, good, good. I'm glad. Yeah, I think it's going to be very useful for everybody.
Sure. So if you any of you want to try this the YARP repository, and you can visit this GitHub URL called github.com/Microsoft/reverse-proxy. And there is the question from the YouTube channel that Tito asked that the YARP is intended to be the alternative of Nginx, and if that is the correct, and then what's the differences and pros and cons? Would you be able to answer?
Yeah, great question. So Nginx can be set up as a reverse proxy. In some ways, you could think of Kestrel as a bit of a reverse proxy, but this is actually a configurable reverse proxy that you can configure inside of your code in ASP.NET with C# code. And so it's actually a lot more powerful, a lot more configurable, a lot more dynamic than any of those are able to be, since most web servers are going to be set a certain way, and then they're going to stay set up that way. That configuration is going to be pretty stable for a period of time. This could actually have, a configuration that you wrote in code dynamically that changes over time or changes based on conditions. So it's pretty powerful when you think about that, basically pushing that proxy layer down right into your code so that you have full control over it. And YARP is being used right now in Microsoft for a lot of things besides migration projects. So if you're already starting to kind of imagine how you might use it, those are probably very valid ideas. But in this talk, I've basically focused on doing it as a way to migrate from ASP.NET on .NET Framework.
Thanks for the comment. The Tito, I think it would be answer for you, and we have the past of the time, so I will leave it to you. Another questions on the YouTube the channel, so that you can answer that. So thanks again, Jonathan, for your valuable sessions.